Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2002 HB40 main lift telescoped, and this main lift has a Deutz Diesel engine. It has a tiny 3-cylinder engine. The complaint on this main lift is that it cranks but it doesn't start. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm the complaint. After confirming the complaint, and then we will talk about what directions we can go to fix this. I'm going to show you the identification plate here. So here is the ID plate. It's a Haulotte, and apparently it's been made in France. So as you can see, it is a, I hope you can see that, it's a HB40 telescoped, and that's the serial number, and it's a 2002. So this machine here cranks but it doesn't start. So now let's crank it and confirm the complaint. So we're gonna have to go on the other side of the machine because the engine is on the right side and the control panel is on the left side of the machine. So we're gonna come over here and turn the key on. So we're gonna turn this key to the orange position. So right there, the key is on, and there's a solenoid. I don't know if you heard that click, but there's a solenoid on the governor, the injection pump governor, to push the governor to the start position. So there's a solenoid that gets energized. So when I first got here, the thing that I checked off camera was that solenoid. So you have to make sure when you turn the key on, you hear the solenoid click. Listen. Did you hear the click? So that's good. So we have to push this button here to crank it. So listen. So as you could hear, the machine is cranking, but it doesn't start. Let's crank it one more time. So as you could hear, the machine cranks, but it doesn't start. Okay, so we have confirmed the complaint. I also paid attention on the way this machine cranks. Listen to it one more time, because when you have a machine that doesn't start, you either have an issue with compression on the engine, or a fuel delivery problem, or an electrical problem. So with the way this engine cranks, just the way it sounds, I don't think we have a compression issue on this engine. Let me crank it one more time and listen to it. So I hear a nice and consistent and even crank cadence, so it sounds really well. So I don't think we have a compression issue. So now let's go to the engine compartment and do a visual inspection. Hopefully we will find something obvious. But if we don't find anything obvious, then we will talk about what directions we can go to fix this. So now let's go in the engine bay. So we're gonna open up this cover. Okay, so here is our engine. Alright, so we are in the engine bay now. This is a little 3-cylinder Deutz Diesel engine. It's a pretty simple and basic diesel engine. It doesn't have a lot of electronics around it, okay? And this should be, hopefully, this should be pretty easy to diagnose. So, I already did the visual inspection. Everything looks good. Everything looks connected. There's a solenoid behind this belt that controls the governor, okay? That controls the rack that turns the plunger inside the pumps to measure or to adjust the amount of fuel that gets delivered to the injectors up here. Now let's stick to the basics first, okay? From experience, when you have an engine on these machines that runs out of oil or is low on oil, you can have a no start condition. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test or check our engine oil level first. So here's the dipstick. I'm going to pull this dipstick out. So right over here. Let me wipe this down right there. I mean, doing this one-handed can be difficult sometimes. So now let's retest or recheck our engine oil level. And as you can see, we have enough oil. So I checked the oil level because sometimes there is a safety feature on these engines where the pump will not get energized, or the injectors here will be kept on the stop position if the oil level is low, because there's a little computer on the other side of the machine that looks at the input from the oil pressure sensor. Okay, if the oil pressure sensor is reporting a low pressure oil, it's not going to start the engine. Okay, this solenoid here will not be energized, because you have to energize this solenoid to start the engine. Okay, so it's a safety feature that prevents the engine from being run if the engine is out of oil, or if you don't have any oil in the engine. So we have oil in the engine, so now the next step is going to be checking our fuel supply. So this line here goes all the way to the back behind this panel where the fuel tank is. So behind there is the location of the fuel tank. So we have to make sure that we have a good fuel supply to the lift pump. Basically what this guy does, so this lift pump's job is to suck fuel out of the fuel tank and pump it through the filter and then to the injection pumps. Okay, this little engine has 3 different pumps, so each cylinder has a pump, and I think they call them mono-cylinder pump. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect this line to check if we have a good fuel supply to the pump. So I'm going to undo this line, and once I disconnect it, we should see a good steady flow of fuel coming out of this line. So let's pull it out, and as you can see, we have good fuel, or there's a good fuel supply here. So we know that we have fuel coming to our lift pump. So I'm going to tighten this clamp one more time. So let's tighten this. Okay, so like I said, this diesel engine is pretty simple, and for this engine to start, we have to have a good fuel delivery system and compression. So I'm gonna get compression out of the way, because based on the way this engine sounds, I don't think we have a compression issue. I don't think we have a mechanical problem on this engine. Okay, oh, someone is texting me. I will talk to them later. Let's finish our video first. So again, I don't think we have a compression issue, so now I'm just gonna focus on the fuel delivery system, because we know that we have fuel coming out of the tank, so we have fuel up to the lift pump. Now we have to make sure that the pumps up here are getting fuel. So I'm gonna remove this cover so that we can get access to the pump. So now let's remove this cover. So I'm going to remove this cover, and there are our injection pumps. Alright, so these pumps here, they call them mono-cylinder pump. Okay, basically each cylinder has its own pump, and they have one rack that connects both of them inside the block, and there's a governor down here that controls the fuel supply to the injectors. So now this engine cannot start if we don't have a good fuel delivery. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to crack these high pressure lines. Let's crack them. And after cracking all of them, I'm going to crank the engine and see if there will be fuel coming out of these lines. So with the engine cranking, we should see a good consistent fuel flow, you know, leaking out of these lines. Okay, so if we have fuel coming out of this, we will know that our fuel supply system to the pump, basically the low pressure system, is good, and then we will just focus on from up here all the way up to the injectors. All right, so basically you have to have pressurized fuel inside the cylinders and pressurized air, because the air that gets compressed inside the cylinder is then heated up I know there's another heater here, air heater, that heats the air that enters inside the cylinder to facilitate the combustion event. But let's make sure we have fuel coming up to the pumps first. So I'm gonna go on the other side of the machine and crank it. While I'm cranking it, you should see fuel coming out of this. So I'll leave you guys here. You will look at, make sure you watch these two nuts here. They're all loose, and we gotta see fuel leaking out of this. So I'll go on the other side and crank it. Alright, so as you could see, we cranked the engine, but there's no fuel coming out of those high pressure lines. So basically our pumps are not getting fuel, okay? So the pumps are starving from fuel, and which pretty much justifies the fact that this engine is not starting, because there's no fuel coming out here. I cranked it twice. While I was cranking it, we should see fuel coming out of these lines. So now this brings me back to the low pressure system, which is basically between the fuel tank and the pump. So between the fuel tank and the pump, we have the filter and the lift pump, okay? So we know, we already tested this, we know that there's a good fuel supply to the lift pump, but I'm wondering if this lift pump is sending fuel to the pumps. Okay, so now what I need to do is I'm gonna test this lift pump now. We know that there's a good fuel supply here, so I'm going to disconnect this line, because this line here is coming from the pump. I hope you can tell there's an arrow here on the filter. So now I'm going to disconnect this hose here, because this is the hose coming from the lift pump. So doing this one-handed can be challenging sometimes. So again, we're just gonna focus on this fuel delivery system first, because we don't have fuel coming out of that high pressure pump. All right, so this line here is disconnected. As you can see, there's no fuel coming out of it. So I'm just gonna leave it hanging here. At this point, we have fuel going to the lift pump, and this line here is coming out of the lift pump. I hope you can really see. It's kind of dark here, but this line is coming out of the lift pump. So I'm gonna leave you guys over here. I'll go back on the other side of the machine and crank it. While I'm cranking it, we should see a pretty decent flow of fuel coming out of this line. If we don't have any fuel coming out of this line, what do you think the issue is going to be? Well, if you have fuel coming from the tank up to the pump, and if you don't have fuel coming out of the pump, then the answer is pretty obvious, right? The issue will be our lift pump. So I'm going to leave you guys over here, focus on this line while I crank the engine. I thought I heard some fuel leaking, but this is the fuel coming out of the this is a little bit of fuel coming out of the filter, because it looks like there's a little bit of fuel inside the filter. So I'm gonna try to block the fuel leaking out of the filter. Now what you need to do is you need to focus on this guy right over here. So I'm gonna go back and crank it one more time. Okay guys, so as you could see, there is no fuel coming out of this line, okay? So the answer at this point is pretty obvious, okay? So let me zoom you guys out. So we should have seen fuel leak out of this line. So since there's no fuel leaking out of this line, so right there is a fuel supply from this line, and then this is the outlet of the lift pump. So since there's no fuel leaking out of this line, so our issue is the lift pump. So we're gonna have to get the lift pump, replace it, and I'm sure once we replace the lift pump, we should be able to see fuel come out of these high pressure tubes. And once we can get fuel to come out of these high pressure tubes, this engine will start. So that was a pretty easy diagnosis. This fuel pump here has to be replaced. So I'll order the fuel pump. Once I get it, then I'll bring you guys back up. And I don't know if I mentioned that already. This is a little Deutz engine. Okay, so I will get the lift pump ordered. Once I get it, I'll bring you guys back up so we can replace it. And once we replace the lift pump, this engine will start. So I'll bring you guys back up once I get the pump. Alright guys, so I did get the lift pump. Here's the new lift pump from Deutz, and here's the part number. Okay, so there's an O-ring here for the lift pump. Now let's get the new pump out of the box. Let's make sure it looks like the one that we have. Alright, so here is our pump. Let me get it out of the bag. Alright, so here's our pump. Okay, it definitely looks like the one we have on here. There is the old one, and here's the new one. So I will seat you guys over here so we can get this pump replaced. Alright, so this here is what we're gonna remove. So I'm gonna remove this fuel supply hose first. Let's get this out of the way. Okay, so we got this removed. So now we're gonna remove this fuel supply line. This is the line that's coming from the fuel tank. So once I disconnect this fuel hose, a lot of fuel will be coming out of it, which is normal because you have to have a constant fuel supply to the lift pump. If we didn't see fuel coming out of here, our issue was going to be an empty fuel tank. But since we have fuel here, so as you can see, there's a good fuel supply to the lift pump. So I'm just gonna pinch this. This is a messy job. This job is really messy because you have fuel leaking all over the place. All right. So now I'm gonna undo these bolts. There are two bolts, actually they are star bolts, that hold the fuel pump in place. I mean the lift pump, you know what I mean. Alright, so here's one bolt for the lift pump. Now I'm gonna remove the second one. Alright, so here comes our lift pump. Here's the old one. So basically there's a cam lobe. I hope you can see in that hole. There's a cam lobe over there for the lift pump on the camshaft inside the block. Okay, so this camshaft lobe here actuates this follower, and then this follower, as it kind of pushes in and out, it's hard, I can't do it with my one finger. As it pushes it in and out, this pump here sucks fuel out of the tank and then pumps it through the filter and up to the injection pumps. Okay, so here's the old one. we're gonna replace it with this. So this is the old one and this is the new one. So I'm gonna get this out of the way. So now we're gonna install this one. I'll put the new O-ring on it and then we will install this. Alright, so now I'm gonna install the new lift pump. Alright, so I got the new lift pump installed. So now I'm gonna tighten the bolts for the lift pump. Okay. The lift pump has got two bolts, one at the bottom and another one over here on the top. I'm gonna tighten the second one now. So right there. So the lift pump bolts are tightened. So here's the new one. So now I'm gonna start reconnecting these fuel hoses. So this one is gonna go over here. Okay. And now I'm gonna remove this. Alright, so as you can see, we have a good supply of fuel to the lift pump. So now I'm going to connect this supply line to the lift pump. I'm going to tighten this line. Alright, so now we're gonna test this new lift pump. Remember, before we replaced the old lift pump, we realized that this fuel line on the outlet of the lift pump wasn't pumping any fuel. So now I'm gonna go on the other side of the machine and crank the engine. While I'm cranking it, remember there was no fuel coming out of this on the other pump. So now with the new pump installed, we should see fuel coming out of this line. So just focus on that line. So just focus on this line as I'm cranking the engine. We should see a nice steady flow of fuel coming out of this line. So now I'm going to crank it. So as you can see, keep cranking. As you can see, there's a good flow of fuel. All right, that's good. So now there's now fuel coming out of this line. So I'm gonna connect it to the fuel filter. So I got this line connected to the fuel filter. So now we're gonna crank it one more time so we can see if there will be fuel coming out of these high pressure tubes. All right, crank it. Fuel coming there, so that's good. Now I'm gonna tighten these high pressure tubes. After all these tubes are tightened, this engine should now start. So now we have a good fuel supply to the pumps. I mean, these mono cylinder pumps. Now this engine should start now. All right, so crank it. Let's see, you ready? idle was too high.
Oh.
Yeah. Right here, this.
That's it, okay.
Yeah, that's thing. Cool. Sweet.
Awesome.
Alright guys, so as you can see, the engine is running. It's so loud next to the engine. So I'm gonna make sure that these tubes are completely tightened up. Alright, so right there, as you can see, the engine is running. That's nice. So the problem was a defective lift pump. So that pump over there was bad. And it's so loud. Actually, let's go back to the other side of the machine and turn it off. And we're gonna try to start it back up a couple times before we wrap up this video. So let's go on the other side of the machine and turn it off. Alright, so I'm gonna turn off the machine. The machine is off, so now let's start it. It should start on one kick. And as you can see, the machine is running. I'm gonna turn it off so we can wrap up this video. Alright guys, so we are back here at the engine bay. The engine is running. The machine is fixed. The issue was a defective lift pump. So here is the old one. The bad lift pump was causing the engine to not start. Now let's talk about a little bit what we did before we wrap up this video. Well, when I got here, the engine was cranking, but it wasn't starting. So we did some tests, and how did we know that this lift pump is bad? So we knew by making sure that there's a good fuel supply to the lift pump. And when we disconnected the outlet of the lift pump, which is this hose, we disconnected it. I went on the other side of the machine to crank it. While I was cranking it, there was no fuel coming out of this. So that was pretty simple and obvious, right? So that told us that the lift pump was not sending fuel to the pumps, because the lift pump's job is to suck fuel out of the tank and then pump it to the injection pumps to start the engine. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Alright, so I'm gonna leave it right over here. I hope you like this video. If you do, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why, so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to my YouTube channel, K Diagnostics. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. Thanks for watching guys. See you next time.